We heard a lot about institutions, a little bit about reframing disruption in terms of how disruption might be corruption of those institutions. So now we're going to move on. We're going to look at disruption from a little bit different angle, the cultural angle. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Michele Gelfand is professor of psychology and an affiliate of the R.H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. Under her direction, the school's cultural lab studies the strength of cultural norms, negotiation, conflict, revenge, forgiveness, diversity, and honor. Their emphasis on interdisciplinary perspectives means that they work with computer scientists, neuroscientists, political scientists, and increasingly biologists to understand all things cultural. She is the author of several books. The most recent book is Rule Makers, Rule Breakers: How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire the World, which we will also have out in the lobby if you'd like to purchase a copy and get Michele to sign it. I'm looking forward. This will be a moderated interview. I'll get Dr. Gelfand talking about her research work and providing some insights. And during the course of the program, I'll open up the floor to your questions. There's a microphone there in the center, if you'll queue up to that, or behind the podium to my left, your right, and wait for me to recognize you, and we'll integrate your questions into this moderated interview. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Michele Gelfand. Well, Michele, welcome to Virginia Military Institute and our Leadership and Ethics Conference. We're very interested in your work, but more interested in how you became a psychologist interested in culture. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the field?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say I'm just delighted to be here. Much of the work that I do on the evolution of culture and its consequences is funded by the military. And I've just been really grateful for the DoD to push people like me, psychologists, to interact with people from different disciplines in trying to understand the complex elephant that we call culture. For about 30 years or so, I've been obsessed with this story about two fish. And these two fish are swimming along one morning, and they pass by another fish, and the fish says to them, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they swim on, and one fish looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And this simple story has a profound point, which is that sometimes it's the most important realities around us that we have the hardest time seeing. And for fish, that's water, but for humans, that's culture. And culture is the passion of my life, to study it and try to understand it. What's really interesting is that it's an incredible puzzle. It's around us all the time, but it's invisible. We take it for granted. It's distinctly human. We perfected this construct way more than other animal species, and it affects everything from our politics to our parenting, our nations to our neurons, but we really ignore it all the time. I was so excited to see that you voted, 50% of you, on cultural intelligence being an important skill. I think you guys are way smarter than average civilians that I teach. And what's interesting is, from a technological point of view, humans have accomplished so much. We put a man on the moon, we've wired the earth, we've eradicated fatal diseases, and we've discovered the laws of gravity. But what if we could discover the laws of culture? These deeper cultural codes, not red versus blue or east versus west or rich, poor, but the deeper cultural codes that drive our behavior. And that's exactly the kind of work that I do. I do want to mention that I wasn't always so interested in culture. I don't know if you could tell where I'm from originally. I'm a New Yorker. And I like to think of my life as a sheltered kid in Long Island, almost like that New Yorker cartoon, a different cartoon than the last talk. It's basically a picture of New York, and then we acknowledge there's New Jersey, but the rest of the world is basically out there. It's a bunch of rocks and some oceans. And that's kind of how I saw the world when I was a young kid. And I went abroad for a semester. I was pre-med. And I went to London, where I experienced a tremendous amount of culture shock. And I remember calling my father. Actually, this phone call changed my life. And he's from Brooklyn, Marty from Brooklyn. And I said, Dad, it's so strange, among other things, that people are just going from London to Paris or London to Amsterdam just for the weekend. And he said to me in his quintessential Brooklyn accent, he said, well, think about it like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania. And I thought, wow, what an awesome metaphor. So the next day, there's a true story. I booked a trip to Egypt, a low-budget tour to Egypt. I had a lot of time on my hands, and I told my dad, it's like going from New York to California. Don't worry. He was not too happy about this. But it was there in Egypt and beyond when I started to travel that I realized that I really have this fish out of water, thinking about how profound an influence culture has on me, but I know nothing about it. And it's like the T.S. Eliot quote that finally when you get back to the place where you started, you discover who you are. And that's what happened to me when I came back to the States. I ditched my plans to be a pre-med doctor, and I went on to get a PhD in cross-cultural psychology. And since then, I've been trying to understand these deeper cultural codes, which is the subject of the book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. So that's kind of the sort of background to how I got there. Life happens when you're making other plans, as they say. And that sure happened to me.
Well, this is your book, provocative title in some ways, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. I think we heard a little bit about that in our previous lecture, but the subtitle has How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. So could you tell us a little bit about the major findings in your book and what tight and loose is?
Sure. So that's really my goal, is to have you kind of take away from this talk these two words, tight and loose, and understand where they come from and their consequences and how we need to balance them in this ever-changing, globalized world. You know, as I traveled as a cross-cultural psychologist, I saw a lot of contrast, like many of you might see around the world. For example, how many people have been to Singapore? It's called the fine country because you can get punished for many different things, from chewing gum in city streets to not flushing the toilet in public settings, and even walking naked in front of your curtains can get you punishment in Singapore. I tell you that just in case you think about doing that in Singapore. If you take a short plane ride over to New Zealand, you see very different behavior. You see people walking barefoot in banks. You see people burning couches on college campuses, not like you guys would do this, and women. And you also see that New Zealand is the only country I know of that has its own national wizard. So this guy was actually a fired professor who set up shop in the city streets of New Zealand, and he was lecturing on everything from rugby to religion. This is not fake news, you can Google it up. And instead of firing or punishing the deviant, the Prime Minister of New Zealand asked him to become the Wizard of New Zealand and to entertain the country. And he does that. He sort of latches himself onto out of eggs on libraries and all such of other shenanigans. But you know, in other contrasts around the world, you see people in Germany, for the most part, staying put on city streets even when there's no cars around. And you see in New York City, my country, my state, my country, people jaywalk constantly. Another puzzling contrast, why can you smoke weed openly in the Netherlands and in some places of the US, but you can get the death penalty for that same behavior in other countries? And this is the kind of contrast that I've been trying to study. And what I've discovered over the last 20 or so years is that while groups vary in a lot of different ways, they vary in a very important attribute, and that is how strictly they adhere to social norms. And social norms are these unwritten rules of behavior that all groups have. In fact, they're an incredible human invention, social norms. They enhance predictability and coordination to an unprecedented way among the human species. And what we know, though, is that groups vary in how strongly they adhere to social norms. Some groups are tight, they have strict rules and punishments for deviance, and other groups are looser. They have much more permissiveness and a wider range of behavior that's seen as permissible. And so you could think about this in a study we published some years ago in the journal Science, where we started to look at this construct across nations. Later, we showed that the same types of attributes of tight and loose nations can be applied to states, to organizations, even to our own households, and even to our own selves. Later, I'll tell you about a tight, loose mindset quiz I have on my website for you to look at to see where you fall on this continuum. But what we could see is that groups like Japan, Singapore, Austria, Germany tend to veer tight. They have stricter rules and regulations than places like New Zealand, Brazil, the Netherlands. Even though all groups have tight and loose elements, they tend to prioritize the strength or looseness of norms differently. And what we found in this study was that there's a really important trade-off that tight and loose gives to groups. So for example, tight groups across the board have much more order. They have more monitoring, they have less crime. There's a great show on NPR, many of you might listen to, called Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. And Peter Sagal is asking the audience, what do Japanese police officers need more of? And we're all guessing, do they need more time off, they need higher pay? Turns out that Japanese police officers need more crime, because Japan has one of the lowest crime rates on the planet, and apparently some Japanese police officers were trying to egg people on to actually commit minor crimes because they were so bored. Tight cultures also have much more synchrony and order. So I can see this in uniformity and we've studied what people wear, what cars they drive around the world. Even city clocks around the world are much more synchronized in tight countries. I've measured how accurate are clocks around city streets in the world. And if you're in tight cultures, all the clocks pretty much say the same thing. In loose cultures, they're really unsynchronized. You're not entirely sure what time it is in places like Greece and Brazil. And finally, in tight cultures also have much more self-control. In your different contexts where there's a lot of potential punishments, then you tend to regulate your behavior more. So there's less alcoholism, less debt, and even less obesity in tight cultures. Even pets actually are much skinnier, I found, in tighter cultures. And loose cultures struggle with order. They have much more crime, less monitoring, they have much less uniformity and synchrony, and they have a host of self-regulation failures. But loose cultures corner the market on openness. They tend to be much more open and tolerant of different people, of different ideas, and even to change. In one study that I just published, I had research assistants around the world wearing these facial warts that I bought for them to wear on their faces. You can buy them on the internet. Or they were wearing tattoos and nose rings, or their normal face. And I asked them to go around the world, after they were standardized in Germany, to go back and ask for directions in city streets, or to ask for help in stores. And it was really clear pattern. In the tighter cultures, people were much less helpful to these people that look so strange, because they threaten the social order. So loose cultures corner the market on openness, and tight cultures struggle with these kinds of issues. And one of the things we wanted to look at is, why do these differences develop in the first place? There's no common geography or religion or tradition or language that unites tight and loose cultures. Tight cultures as far back as Sparta, or in modern day Singapore, share many attributes. And likewise, ancient Athens also shares attributes with loose cultures. And one of the things we found in this research is that there's one very important factor that predicts tight and loose, and that is the degree to which groups have a lot of threat. So in our research, we measured how much threat do groups have from Mother Nature, constant famine and disasters, like in Japan, or how much conflict do they have on their own soils? How many times in the last 100 years has a country been potentially invaded by its neighbors? I remember my daughter was asking me when she was 8 if we were worried about Mexico or Canada invading us. Of course, some people think that now, but we have, as a country, have existed in very secure conditions for many, many years. We have our share of conflict, of course, but we haven't been worried, like other countries around the world, about being invaded constantly. We have our share of disasters, sure, but not the same chronic levels of disasters like places like Japan. And this is what we found. We measured how much Mother Nature threat and human nature threat groups had. And the simple principle is that when you have a lot of collective threat, you need stronger rules to coordinate to survive. Norms provide that coordination power. When you're in a disaster, you want people behaving themselves. You want them not defecting. And strong rules cultivated over generations and generations in response to collective threat are really important for survival. Another way to think about this is that looser groups can afford to be more permissive. There's other factors that predict tight and loose, but I just want to mention that this tight and loose order and openness trade-off and the evolution of tightness, the same patterns you can see at the state level. So instead of looking at red versus blue states, we can now look at a map of the 50 states, as I've published, that differentiates tight and loose states that house the very similar pattern. And same with organizations. We could see that organizations that lean tight tend to have a lot of coordination and threat. They also prioritize order over openness. Even in our own households, we can think about this as well. Are you leaning tight? Are you leaning loose? And this is important because we can have all sorts of conflicts around this construct in our daily lives. So understanding where you are on your own default in terms of tight-loose. Are you, for example, an order Muppet, using the Sesame Street metaphor, which is like Bert and Kermit the Frog? They like a lot of order. They pay attention to rules. Or are you more of a chaos Muppet, like we call it, This is like Cookie Monster, an animal. I have to mention that, truth be told, I'm sort of lean loose. My husband, he's a lawyer. He's in a context where he has a lot of accountability, which is a big driver of tightness. He veers tighter. So we have all sorts of negotiations along this construct. And I can talk more about how this impacts organizations and also what's the sweet spot of tight-loose as we continue our conversation.
So part of that research, in the way you framed it, go to sort of security needs against a threat. But the other side of that coin is I want to be happy. So what generates a happy culture?
This is the sort of million-dollar question, right? So I'm going to ask you to vote. If you were to say, you know, what's better, tight or loose, how many people are going to vote for tightness? How many people are going to vote for looseness? How many people are going to abstain? So this is a classic question that has been something of interest among ancient historians, philosophers, economists, psychologists for centuries. You know, do we have rules or should we have freedom? And there were people like Plato and Confucius and Hobbes that thought we need rules. I mean, people are really nasty, so we need to have a lot of rules to regulate their behavior, like we heard in the last talk. And then you have people like John Stuart Mills or Freud, who thought rules are really make you neurotic. I mean, he was kind of neurotic, right? And they argued for freedom. And the question has been, which is the case? And what I've found in my work is that the answer is neither. That actually it's a curvilinear, we call it, relationship between tight, loose, and well-being, and happiness, and stability, and and even suicide. So the idea is that groups might need to veer tight or loose for good reasons, like I just mentioned. But it's the groups that get extreme in either direction, that either get extraordinarily tight or extraordinarily loose, that have the most dysfunction. We've showed this at the societal level, that the groups that are the most tight and loose have higher suicide, have higher blood pressure, higher depression, and lower happiness. And this principle also applies to organizations. Again, we might need to veer tight or loose for good reasons, but take United, for example, something I wrote about last year. This is a place where you want to have some rules. This is an airline. You don't want people making all sorts of weird decisions in this context. But arguably, United got too tight, started to normatize everything. And people were stopping, not really thinking about the rules anymore. I interviewed a lot of people at United who said that we're just blindly following the rules. And on the flip side, you have places like Uber or Tesla that should veer loose, but they arguably are getting too loose, so much that they're chaotic places and can't scale up and can't meet deadlines. And so the idea here is that we have to be ambidextrous as leaders. What that means is we have to be able to understand, even if we need to veer tight, when should we and how can we insert some flexibility into a tight system? I call this flexible tightness. And on the flip side, how can you, in a loose system, insert some structure when you need to, structured looseness? And the best leaders really understand that it's the balance of tight and loose in their context that really is going to lead to effectiveness. It's also the case with parenting, by the way. I'm a parent of 2 teenage girls, and I can tell you that's a very threatening context, and I would like to lock them up for years or take them to Singapore. But in fact, you know, it's the same principle. Research in psychology shows that either very highly monitored and helicopter-type parents and very laissez-faire parents, on the flip side, produced really maladaptive kids. And so this principle is something that we see across different levels of analysis. We even see it with birds, actually. We know that birds that are too tightly synchronized, when a predator comes in, get eaten up. On the flip side, birds that are not synchronous at all can't communicate when a predator comes in. And so we can see this kind of balance of being synchronized and unsynchronized and structured, unstructured is really one of those important things that we need to understand. I want to mention also that we can use the principle to understand some puzzling dynamics around the world. You know, when ISIS first took over in Mosul, people in the US were really surprised, but many people in the region were not. And the simple principle is that when there's a lot of chaos, people will want order. Erich Fromm talked about this years ago. And what we saw in ISIS is that there was a complete collapse of culture. And in those contexts, people want strong leaders to help them coordinate because disorder and chaos is untenable. Just like I mentioned, extreme looseness is untenable. Americans don't understand, why do people in the Philippines support Duterte? or Putin. And it's the same exact principle. If you look at the dynamics of what was happening in the Philippines over the last several years, you see it was becoming extraordinarily chaotic. And the same can be said of how do we understand the desire for populist leaders, something we talked about in the last session. It's not so surprising that whether threat is real or imagined produces the same tightening psychology. And this is what we find. In our research, we could see that the people who felt the most threat, they perceived threat from immigrants, from ISIS, from North Korea, before the US last election, felt the US was too loose, that the norms were really becoming too permissive, and this was driving in part their desire for Donald Trump. This is not a sort of modern phenomenon. We also saw it, years ago when people feel disorder, when they feel threatened, again, either real or imagined, they want strong leaders to help them coordinate. It's a basic evolutionary principle that actually makes a lot of sense. What we're trying to deal with nowadays is how do we separate real threat from fake threat? So we know, as Jonah was telling us, the world's become a much safer place. Pinker would say the same thing. Violence has declined. We've eradicated fatal diseases. There's so many great things about where the world is today, but people still, whether real or imagined, feel a lot of threat. And when you feel threatened, this is going to drive a tight psychology. And that's happening in Brexit, and it's happening all around the world. I think one of the implications of this for us trying to counteract these forces is to really try to deal with real threats. In our case, in the US, we're a really loose culture in general. And we've gotten looser and looser. We just published a paper in Nature that shows that we've actually gotten really super loose over the last 200 years as a nation. And we also have become more innovative. Innovation and looseness go hand in hand. But that's very threatening to some people. That looseness can be seen as a threat or an opportunity. And what we know in the US is that people from the working class, from rural areas, are suffering. They're experiencing a lot of threat, real threat. But in the US, we don't tend to actually have a lot of infrastructure to deal with those kinds of threats. In Germany, they do. For example, the way that Germany is structured in terms of education is vocational training is seen as in a very positive light. People have standardized certificates they can use to go to and from different jobs. They don't have the same, they have a cushion that we don't have in the United States. And we really need to reach out and help people who are feeling threatened, because that's a big driver. And again, it makes a lot of sense. Instead of sort of looking at people and thinking, how can you vote this way, or how can you think this way on both sides of the aisle, we can think about where their psychology is that might be driving those attitudes. So I think that's just a couple of implications about the work. And toward the end of the book, I talk about how we can harness the power of social norms to better our world. We invented them. They're the greatest thing we've ever invented, as far as I'm concerned. But we also don't really think about them ever, and we don't use them mindfully. And so we can think about what context do we need to try to tighten that are becoming too loose. I nominate the internet as one example of that. I mean, we're living online now, and our work shows that it's not the amount of time people spend online, it's the amount of normlessness they perceive online that's affecting their well-being. So let's think about what the Goldilocks Principle looks like on the internet, which is where we live now. How do we sort of start from a bottom-up and top-down perspective to strengthen norms in a way that's healthy? It doesn't squelch dissent. It doesn't squelch the freedom that also produces that balance. So there's lots of ways, and we think about how do we loosen norms that perhaps are counterproductive. And there's lots of examples of this, but what it suggests is that we have the power to do this, that culture is not our destiny, that we can, once we understand the codes and their logic, we can be mindful about using them to better the world.
Okay, great. You mentioned this thing called the Goldilocks Principle. I love fairy tales, and sometimes in cultures, fairy tales actually help define a culture, and as Jonah Goldberg was talking about, civilization and what we think about ourselves. So Goldilocks is a great story we learn very young. Tell us about the Goldilocks Principle.
Yeah, so many of us who are parents, we read this book far too many times that we care to. But it's really, this idea that we have to have balance. I mean, this is beyond Goldilocks, it's Aristotle. It's many different philosophers who talked about this. Not too hot, not too cold, not too soft, not too hard. This is what the book is about. In principle, it's a little bit harder to operationalize, but what I do in the book is, again, talk about how we can think about the strength of norms in terms of not too tight, not too loose, and manage that in our own everyday lives. And as leaders, I think, particularly in the military, it's really important because this organization and institution needs to be tight in many ways. It has a lot of coordination and threat needs. But at the same time, as leaders, we need to insert some discretion into that system, because otherwise, when people go off-site, they tend to lose control. We're studying this right now with the Navy. It's the same principle, by the way, like with kids. If you tighten up too much when they go away to college, guess what? Those kids have not learned to manage their impulses so well because their parents have been managing them. In the military, we need to really kind of embody this kind of flexible tightness to find domains that we can give some discretion. And so this is one implication of Goldilocks. It also affects our parenting. So I mentioned that I negotiate tight and loose all the time with my kids, with my spouse. Sounds a little cheesy. But for example, we can think about what domains need to be tight in this household. For us, we decided, I think Todd lost the negotiation, but we decided that the tight domains need to be schoolwork, health, and how we treat each other with respect. But what domains can be loose? Now, I would like the house to be clean and the kids to be tidy, but I figured we can let that go. That's where Todd says, oh gosh, you guys drive me crazy. But that's one domain we've agreed upon can be looser, including other things like time to go to bed. There's ways that we can negotiate this in our everyday lives in order to achieve that kind of balance, whether we're leaders, parents, and so forth.
Great. I'm going to open up the floor to any questions you have. If you'll just come up to one of the microphones. While I'm waiting for someone, brave soul, to get up and ask the first question, Michele, you do work with the Department of Defense in trying to look at not only in the sense of understanding culture, but perhaps giving us a few tips about how to operate in a multicultural environment. How can we use your insights about loose and tight at the level of junior leaders to operate effectively?
Well, I think that, one of the new terms of art in psychology is cultural intelligence. What you could nominated here, and cultural intelligence, like any kind of intelligence, requires a lot of learning. It's a muscle that can be developed to understand, to have an appreciation of other cultures, to start reading and thinking about other cultures. But most importantly, in my point of view, is to understand why they evolved to be the way they are in the first place. Because the fact is that we can understand the culture, but we still tend to be very judgmental about those cultures because they're so different from ours. But once we understand, well, if I was accidentally born in Singapore, let's just say Singapore as an example, maybe you would really actually appreciate that you're not allowed to chew gum. So as an example, one of the predictors of tightness is population density. And our argument's pretty simple. When you have a lot of people around you, there's potential chaos and you need strict rules. And Lee Kuan Yew was actually kind of a cultural psychologist. If you look at his autobiography, the dude was talking about all the things I'm talking about without publishing them in academic journals. But he said to people in Singapore, we need to be more rugged. We need to be more strict in order to coordinate to survive this context where we have low arable land, we have tremendous amount of diversity, we have tremendous potential conflict because we have multiple ethnic groups. We don't have a lot of those conditions in the United States. And the gum ban is actually pretty interesting. In a place that has 20,000 people per square mile, there's a lot of mouths per capita that are chewing a lot of gum. And what happened in Singapore is that people were chewing gum and throwing it on the floor, as people do when they chew gum, and it was causing a national catastrophe because there was gum all over the place. This is in the late 80s. Even sensors on trains and elevators were getting blocked and causing traffic problems. So Lee Kuan Yew said, guys, we're just gonna have to ban this tasty treat. In this context, gum is really causing a lot of problems. And to an American, that sounds absolutely preposterous. But once you understand the logic of why that makes sense in that context, given its ecology, given its history, we can become less judgmental about other cultures, and it makes it a lot easier for us to understand them. I'll give you another example, which is on the psychology of honor. So we do a lot of work on honor in the Middle East, and we do a lot of computational models of honor, and why does this trait tend to evolve in certain contexts? Now, we emphasize honor in the United States, of course, but in general, in the United States, we have trained our children for generations to say, your self-worth is really not easily stolen. It's like a skeleton. We have rights, we have dignity. That's not something that's really negotiable. But we have had strong institutions to help us to guard that kind of value. And we have a lot of natural resources. In the Middle East and other contexts where there's weaker institutions and where there's a lot of struggle for resources over generations, your reputation, your honor becomes a commodity that can be gained, lost, and stolen. And that's the kind of commodity that is more important than bread, than money. And so when we go into a negotiation in the Middle East, and I can tell you I would do a lot of work there where I keep violating people's honor by accident. There's so many ways that you can violate people's honor inadvertently. If you're on your phone, for example, in a meeting in the Middle East, that signifies you're not as important, I'm not as important in your eyes as your phone. And that's dishonorable to me. You just stole some of my honor. That United States would not, it might bother us, we might get irritated, but it's not a sense that you just stole some of my self-worth. If we understand the conditions under which honor evolves, and then the specific ways in which we can gain and lose and steal it, then we can be in a much better place to negotiate in these contexts. If we understand that there's swift trust in the United States in negotiation, we sort of trust until we verify. Makes a lot of sense. This is a getting to yes principle. We live in a context, until recently, where our institutions are weakening, as Jonah said. We can trust people and then verify. That makes a lot of sense. We can trust people because we're constantly coming and going through different groups. If you're in the Middle East, that principle is just silly. There's swift distrust in the Middle East. You start from a place where you need to actually gain people's trust, because to trust would be extraordinarily silly and make people vulnerable in a context where people steal each other's honor, where there's weak institutions, and where there's a dearth of natural resources. So there's lots of ways that we can think about culture that go beyond just the kind of superficial, do this, do that, don't do that. If we really dig deep into the cultural codes and why they evolved the way they did, we have one customer, I see. Then we can be much more empathic and much better leaders in these contexts, because we're trying to make a difference. This is what's so tragic about cultural differences in the region, especially in the Middle East, where we might go in and try to be building hospitals, trying to build civic society, but without understanding the cultural codes that have been driving these groups for centuries, we make a lot of mistakes by accident, and it costs a lot of time, energy, lives. So that's just a long-answered way that cultural intelligence takes time and energy and empathy to develop. Yeah.
So hi, I'm Lila Leverett from Christopher Newport University. And you said something in this last part that reminded me a lot of my home state. So I'm from Arkansas, which we are the second most impoverished state. We've got lots of problems, trust me. And coming from Arkansas to Virginia at CNU specifically, we have a lot of kids from Northern Virginia, and we just tend to have a higher household income. And so it's very interesting coming from a state where I saw a lot of poverty, a lot of a lack of education, just lots of problems, lots of socioeconomic problems, and I understood why we had a lot of hostility, especially between groups. I went to an inner city high school, and I lived in the town that the white people ran to when that high school integrated in the 50s. So it was a very, very huge cultural gap, and the fact that the two people from the different towns had not spoken to each other in a number of years was very apparent and very unfortunate. And I'm just curious, going to the school that I go to now, there's not a whole lot of awareness of those great differences in a state such as Arkansas, because a lot of the people I go to school with have not necessarily had those struggles of a lack of resources and or a fight for resources and stability. And I'm just curious, how would a leader come to bring those groups together, knowing that they are there, and also get other people to understand that if we see them as the other, then they will always be the other?
Yeah, this is such a phenomenally important question. I think part of the issue, and you alluding to it, and it was, Jonah talked about it also to some extent, is this idea that we live in these increasing echo chambers, right? So we can easily stereotype people. And we know in psychology, if you have very little interaction, meaningful interaction with people from other groups, that it can cause us to really be, really never quite get to understand the human, just the common humanity that exists across groups. One of the ways that we just recently did this, I just talked about this in an LA Times piece a couple days ago. was strangely enough using daily diaries to help unite groups, to help them to get out of the echo chambers. And it was, I'm just going to start with the study I started with. This is between the US and Pakistan, so it's not between groups in Arkansas, but I think it could be used in a lot of different contexts. And it's an interesting story around research. So we interviewed people in Pakistan and the US, and they had very extreme stereotypes about each other, and a lot of distrust and even disdain. So Pakistanis, they didn't just think about Americans as loose. They thought they were half naked all the time and calling the police on our parents if they're too strict, and we're drinking beer for breakfast. I don't think any of you guys do that. And so they had, we are a loose society, but they had extreme stereotypes about us. And we asked Americans about Pakistanis if they knew where Pakistan was, which was a big if. They tended to think about Pakistanis only being in mosques all the time and being super constrained. So not just tight, but like super, super tight. They didn't imagine Pakistanis playing sports or reading poetry or dancing. These are not contexts that came to mind. It's really easy to stereotype each other when we live in these different groups. We have no interaction. We live through the media. So anyway, we did a study that totally failed. It was an interesting study, the first study, where we tried to prime people to think about another cultural group in a context they never thought about. So we showed Pakistanis real pictures of Americans dressed up kind of like you are in a more formal way. We showed them pictures of Americans with their parents having dinner. We also showed Pakistanis, Americans, pictures of Pakistanis in looser contexts that they really are in, dancing, reading poetry, playing sports. And we wanted to see if we contextually prime people to think about the broader range of situations that we're in, and many of which are similar, that get at that common humanity. Would they become less stereotype of each other? It turns out that study totally failed. We got nothing from this study. It was 2 years of a huge headache, a lot of gray hair that I dye. But really what happened was they didn't believe that this is the case, that they're actually in these situations. So we said, all right, we're just going to gather daily diaries for 10 days from Americans and Pakistanis. We're not going to edit these diaries. And then we're going to randomly assign people in Pakistan and the US to receive every day the diary of someone from either their own country or the other country. And they were told this is a study about social memory. They weren't told this is about intercultural understanding. And it was remarkable. This paper is coming out in a journal called Behavioral Science and Policy, and it was remarkable to see how much just simply reading about people's actual lives really helped reduce the cultural distance that they saw people through. And it also changed their stereotypes of each other. Americans started to think about Pakistanis as having more freedom, even though they recognized they were tighter, and being less aggressive, like we see in the media. And on the flip side, Pakistanis started to see Americans as being more moral. They didn't see them as amoral and as ultra loose. They recognized in their comments to us that, yes, we see the cultural differences. But the thing about echo chambers is that it make us really extremize perceptions of other groups. And so I think the best leaders are helping people to understand there are differences, but we might be exaggerating them. And find ways, whether they're daily diaries or there are other ways to bring people together, to understand that they actually have many similar anxieties, similar situations they face. That helps people to build a global village, so to speak, where we can have more empathy and understanding.
Great. Please.
Good morning, Gabe Cervantes. I'm a researcher out of a think tank in Silicon Valley. And you mentioned that as a culture faces more threats, it becomes tighter. And as you look long and you start to see these disruptions and increasing threats from climate disruption, what are the long-term implications for that in terms of how we organize culturally, but also, kind of the effects on politics, on social norms, and on leadership looking long?
Yeah, this is I couldn't have asked for better questions. This is such a great question, I think, and I talk about this question in the book, because one of the implications is that it might seem that we're just going to get tighter and tighter in different pockets. I think a lot of the current disruptions are happening across tight and loose lines. So we see this not now just nations, but also rural and manufacturing areas that are really struggling versus cities that are more cosmopolitan and don't see as much threat. So this axis is kind of shifting around the world, but it's still necessary. It's still really related to tight and loose. And one implication that is slightly dismal is that groups will get tighter and tighter, and that it will help us with order, but not with openness. And that's the key Goldilocks issue, is how do we balance order and openness? Now, I take a slightly more optimistic view in the book, one is based anecdotally, the other is based on some recent computational work we're doing on what happens when threats get extreme. In the book, I talk about examples of groups that when they're facing common threats, ecological threats, like Turkey and Greece at one point, Bangladesh, India, how actually these collective threats brought groups together in ways that they had never been before. It kind of helped to maximize coordination across groups that increased openness, but also maintain order. And it sounds a little bit like a fairy tale, but actually in our most recent computational work, we've seen that as threats increase, groups do get more ethnocentric. They start tagging people based on their groups. They become more tribal, like Jonah was talking about. But actually, when threats get extraordinarily severe, we see that is actually reversing. That in fact, we see much more openness at extreme levels of threat. Now, I'm not arguing we should have extreme threat. It's just kind of one of the implications of that storyline. But it does suggest that, you know, as we sort of reframe our group identity to be more collective, that helps us to manage threats, but also not reduce openness. And I think that that's one thing that we can be trying to do mindfully around the world, is shifting our perceptions of who we are, who the outgroup is, and how we need each other, and we will need each other as we're dealing with more of these kind of collective threats that don't see national boundaries. And that might be something to encourage, and to, again, I think culture's invisible and it's omnipresent, but we need to talk about it more and be more deliberate about how we use it to our advantage.
Sir.
My name is Cadet Jared Goss from Marion Military Institute from Alabama. You said that, like, we're talking about cultures and countries, correct? So each country has different cultural areas. For example, like California is not going to be the same as Alabama or even Virginia and New York. I'm a military brat, so I've been blessed to live in France and all these other places. So in France in particular, one that I can relate to, in northern France, because the weather, like you're talking about, nature has a lot to do with culture. It rains a lot more, so people tend to stay in their houses and isolate themselves. In southern France, they're outgoing and tend to visit with people, go out and have lunch together. Right. How can you define a country's culture, knowing that there's so many different subcultures in one country?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And in fact, you know, when we set out to look at the US 50 states and whether we can see variation in tight loose, we had to have the hunch that this is a big, diverse country. We can find diversity in tight loose here in the US. We can probably find it in France. We don't think we can see it as much in places like Singapore, which are more homogeneous. But even a recent paper has looked at China. Now, China is clearly tighter than the US. So we could see, when we compare countries relatively speaking, there's no question there's a microscope metaphor. We can zoom out and see, okay, we can see that they're in general tighter or looser. But we can zoom in, and I see that we can kind of hold both of these microscopic visions in mind. We can zoom into China. A recent paper that came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science mapped the 30+ provinces in China on tight loose, with some really interesting parallels to the work that we've done in other nations within the US. Some differences also, for example, with some exceptions, the farther you are from Beijing, from the eye of the government, the looser the provinces, with some exceptions. But some other parallel findings about threat and about ecology, tightening up groups, and similar consequences in terms of order and openness at the province level. So that's just to say that we can zoom out with a microscope and say, you know, United as an airline is definitely tighter than Uber. But we can zoom into each of these places and find tight and loose elements. And I think that's really, it's exciting to use the same principle, the same language to understand dynamics with whatever level of analysis you're interested in. And so I think that's a useful thing. Now, that's not to say there's no other ways that cultures vary, but I think it's a very important dimension. I was going to mention this is not a modern phenomenon. We just recently studied with the anthropologists about 100 or so pre-industrial societies. And we coded these ethnographies for degree of norm strength, and we see very similar patterns in terms of the predictors and consequences of tight loose in pre-industrial societies. So it's not something that's invented recently. It's something that we can see far back in our history. And that's just to say, again, we can look at things at different levels and different time spans and try to see whether there's homology, whether there's similarity in the dynamics that we see.
So context matters. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Cadet Kirsten Engel. I go to VMI. So I was wondering if there was a correlation, or if you think there's a correlation between working to live and living to work. Because if you look at countries that are happier and like the obesity rate is less, like Spain, I'd say, they work to live and they're happier. And I think in America, we live to work.
Yeah,
So I was wondering if there's a correlation between like tight and loose cultures and living to work and working to live.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think kind of, that's a great question, and I love the use of the correlational terminology. You know, we don't have data on that per se, but clearly there's much more emphasis on sort of leisure in loose cultures. There's more emphasis on fun in loose cultures. Actually, in the book I talk about this. I compare US states on tight and loose, and we find the same parallel, that tight states are really orderly, they have less divorce, less mobility, they have less debt, and they're more polite. So New York is the #1 rude state in the union. And that's why we flip people off all the time, right? You get in serious trouble when you're flipping people off in the South from New York. But what we find is that loose states, while they struggle with that order, they have more creativity and more openness, and they score higher on fun, on recreational activities. They're much ruder, but they have more fun. So there might be something about some connection to sort of loosening up and having a sense of beyond work identity. But I'm not sure how strong the correlation would be. I think we can find all 4 quadrants. And I think your point is really around trying to have a multiple identities, not just work, that we have to really kind of cultivate that in a context where everything seems to be about our achievements, which is very American. It's all, our individualism is also very competitive. It's very different than Scandinavian individualism or Australian individualism, which is much more horizontal. So people not only work to live in our cultures in the US that are very individualistic, but they also are working to outperform other people, to beat them, to be competitive. And that's a very distinct type of American individualism that's different than other species of individualism around the world that are more horizontal. So there's a lot of nuances around that. So let's talk further. We can design a study on this.
Sure.
Good morning, Miss. I was curious on what you thought about the effect civil wars might have on states and cultures gravitating towards a tighter or a looser culture. You have countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Zimbabwe, Iraq, kind of coming back from almost disastrous situations where the culture is kind of torn apart.
Yeah. This is such an important question because really it speaks to the chaos that we have in these kinds of settings. And like I mentioned, when there's chaos, people yearn for some kind of order. It could be coming from a terrorist group. It could come from an autocratic leader. One thing that I write about in the book was kind of why the dynamics in Egypt were not so puzzling, what happened. You know, we were amazed and puzzled when we saw the people in Egypt overthrow Mubarak. And only, you know, some months later, we see a new autocratic leader taking his place. And this is what I call autocratic recidivism, sort of the repeating cycle of autocrats. And actually, it relates to your question because what happened in that context is when you take a strong autocrat leader out, and by the way, these people are in business to get people to distrust each other, to squelch civil society. Because guess what? If there was trust that people had in each other, they would overthrow these crazy leaders, right? So you take an autocratic leader out, and the system goes from extraordinarily tight to extraordinarily loose or chaotic. And we showed that on the ground. We had people out measuring how chaotic do people feel, how normalist do people feel in Egypt. We saw people screaming freedom for a little while, but actually, without any mechanism to coordinate and to trust other people, we saw that people who feel extreme normlessness wanted the Salafi government to take over, or the Muslim Brotherhood. So there was a strong psychological need in that context, after Mubarak was overthrown, to put another autocrat in his place. And so this is a cycle that we see in a lot of places. Tunisia was an exception in many ways because they had some element of civil society. Egypt, you're not even allowed to form a soccer league or have other ways to kind of, other meso-institutions to get people to interact with each other, to form some kind of social trust. So that's just to say that we need to be really aware of these contexts. Iraq is a similar issue right now, that when there's perceptions of disorder, it will invite these kind of autocratic and extremist forces.
Hi, Lily Edwards, East Tennessee State University. So America is normally seen as like a cultural melting pot, so I would say that it's looser in comparison to these other countries. But there's a lot of things that still happen that are kind of questionable. Like, I grew up in a small town where a lot of things I heard growing up were like, if you live in America, you need to speak our language, or this uprise of the LGBTQ community is like a really big deal going on right now. So as a leader, how do we face these problems and kind of bring people to readjust to the new social norms going around?
Yeah, this is such a great point. And in fact, you know, we see that the U.S. in general is looser than many countries, but we have lots of variation in tight loose. The South tends to be much tighter than the coasts. And part of that is predicted by, for example, natural disasters. Our data show really clearly that the tightest states have a lot of threat, whether they're from pathogens, from natural disasters. They also have less diversity, and diversity promotes openness. And we see from early 1800s, the coast had far more diversity. We're talking hundreds of years that we have a melting pot happening in certain aspects of this country, where when you have a lot of diversity, it's hard to agree upon rules, and it fosters tolerance. Now, some of these places, California was not always the open, sort of tolerant place that it has grown to be. California, by the way, is a good exception. It also suffers some natural disasters, but because it was a startup state and because it has a lot of diversity and people flock to it who are risk takers, for centuries now it's been a very loose place. And we need to recognize that the differences in the US run deep. They run deep in terms of who settled where. The South tends to be more of an honor culture, and honor cultures tend to be tight. And those cultural norms came for a long, long time. And they're not going to change overnight. Americans are known to be very impatient. That's another sort of, I'm very proud to be American, but de Tocqueville even noticed this about us, that we are a young nation and we like to see change quickly, and change takes time. So I think that part of the issue is, how do you introduce more diversity and more dissent into a tight culture, or how do you introduce more order and structure into a loose culture? We need both elements. So that's one way to think about that. Each culture has its strength that are our own liabilities, and it will take time to build a culture, insert some of that openness into those cultures. It will take, negotiation in a sense over time.
One last question.
Thanks, sir. Good morning, ma'am. I'm Cadet Laster. I'm a second classman here, or junior. And I had a question kind of addressing one of your earlier statements and even riding off of this last question, specifically for me as one of the cadet leaders and some of the cadet lieutenants and even the commandant staff, or us going into early industry, and especially for some of us who are commissioning into the military. How would you advise for someone who's going into a stereotypically strict environment to kind of introduce some of that looseness that you were talking about without appearing weak or trying to reset some of the cultural norms that are there? And how would you do that without almost appearing hostile to the group and what's been normalized in that group?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. I actually talk about it in the section in the organizational chapter on how do you, there's no simple answer, I should say. But one of the things we know is that first we can diagnose, is the environment ultra tight? Is there just a ton of monitoring? Are there tons of rules? Are people walking on eggshells? And if you can diagnose that, then you start thinking about, I have to insert some discretion into that system in non-safety domains, in non-health and sort of survival domains. And for example, allowing exploration, decentralizing a bit in a unit, encouraging pushback, helps to give people that kind of autonomy that balances out that constraint. And that's one way to think about loosening up a tight group. There's also, on the flip side, and by the way, it's hard to do that because of the needs that people have. Because when you're trying to loosen up a tight environment, people have a lot of control needs. So it's really scary sometimes to introduce that discretion. So it can't be done very quickly. It's got to be done in very small ways. We know from our research that tight cultures take much longer to change. So inserting a change without a lot of due diligence and a big change is likely to be a big problem, going from tight to loose. On the other hand, when you're trying to tighten up a loose context that's gotten too chaotic, people in these contexts have high needs for autonomy, and so it's really big pushback for a leader to come in and start doing things that tighten things up. That includes centralizing. It includes setting benchmarks and monitoring more, having more accountability. This is the essence of tightness. And so in this case, what we think is that important is to collaborate with people, to help to negotiate this, to think about what domains need to be tighter and to get buy-in to do that. Again, it's using the language and being culturally intelligent by talking about it and actively understanding how people might react when switching gears in norms.
Okay, great advice for young leaders. You got to get your head into understanding the culture, the norms especially, and sometimes going slow means going fast. One last plug for your assessment, your cultural intelligence assessment.
Oh yeah, so well, on my website, which is just michelegelfand.com, you can see a tight loose mindset quiz, and it's actually based on data. And the idea is that people who veer tight tend to notice rules more, they tend to be more focused on minimizing mistakes, and they tend to like structure and order. People who veer looser, again, it's a continuum, tend to not notice rules as much. They tend to be more risk-taking, sometimes more impulsive, and they tolerate a lot of ambiguity. And of course, we all shift gears on tight and loose all the time during the day. Like, this is a very tight situation. We're all sort of in a tight mindset. If I started singing and dancing or breaking out some bourbon, you'd think that was really weird, and you'd give some feedback in your sessions, like, you should really be more careful about who you bring here. You know, but tonight after the dinner, it'll be much looser. Libraries are tighter than public parks. So what's amazing is we can easily adapt to the normative strength of the environment, easily, without even thinking about it. But we all also have our own default of what we prefer. And that's based on our socialization. It's based on our culture, our gender, our class. And often a lot of the conflict, so this test gives you a sense of where you fall on the continuum. And it starts to sort of make you think about the people around you. Where do they fall on the continuum? How might you understand why it makes sense for them to be a little different than you versus them just being annoying? And how do you start thinking about managing conflicts more productively based on differences in tight loose mindset? So that's the mindset. There's another quiz that's on cultural intelligence that I can email to you that's not on the website. That's a self-report of intelligence on cultural differences.
It's great. Well, let's please give a round of applause to Dr. Gelfand.
Thank you.